Next up, what's going on with research? Okay, I know that everybody wants to know what are the options? How do I know what's out there? How do I know if it's right for me? And we have Lucy Norcliffe-Kaufmann here today. Very happy to have her here. Assistant Professor of Neurology and Neuroscience at New York University School of Medicine. She's the Associate Director of the NYU Dysautonomia Center. She's lead investigator in the natural history study of MSA. So GLOMSAR in part is funded by our partners here at the MSA Coalition. And she's very well versed in MSA and the research going on. So I'm going to turn it over to Lucy to present to you and share her expertise. Thank you, Lucy.
Thank you, Cindy, for that introduction. I promise to be quick because I know we're running a little over time, and so let's move quickly along. I have one word for you today, and that message is hope. I really do feel that there is great movement in the field of MSA research right now, and many reasons why we should be very hopeful. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about clinical trials, research, and you. Okay? And the message of hope was something that I heard when I was in Austria 2 weeks ago at the European Federation of Autonomic Societies. And here you see some of the faculty from that meeting. Here is Professor Niall Quinn, and who was heavily involved in the diagnostic criteria for MSA. And here's Dr. Gregor Wenning, who's again a leader in the field of MSA research. And both of them reiterated that really the field has moved very far along, and we're in a good position and we're hopeful that there are new trials that can reach the clinic. So let me start by telling you what I'm going to tell you, and then you can fall asleep or have more coffee, and I'll try and keep you entertained. I'm going to tell you about what I think on what we think as a team at NYU are two of the biggest breakthroughs in research in MSA that have happened in recent years. I'm going to talk a little bit about clinical trials, explain the type of clinical trials that you can participate and what you should expect when you're participating in clinical trials, and then tell you a little bit about the future work that we have to do together. So the first real breakthrough that came with MSAs, we have a better understanding of the molecular basis of the disease. You heard a little bit about the word prion diseases, or prion, depending on where you're from and how you pronounce it. And I just want to tell you a little bit about that and help you understand that how this may impact you. This is Stanley B. Prusiner, and he won in 1997 the Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine for discovering prions, which are infectious proteins that self-propagate. You know this already, but proteins are very clever small molecules in the body. They're encoded by our DNA. And they're really like a long string of beads that are made up of component pieces known as amino acids. And these proteins fold and unfold in our body, but they actually crumple down into a final shape with a biological function. And they're essentially like little machines working in our cells the whole time. The protein that is linked to the pathophysiology of MSA, which is something you've been hearing about today, is a protein called alpha-synuclein. Alpha-synuclein is found normally in the brain, and it's abnormal forms of this protein that clump together in MSA and other diseases. And you see similar protein accumulation in diseases like Parkinson's disease, multiple system atrophy, and pure autonomic failure. And this is why you'll also often hear as MSA being linked to Parkinson's disease, because they really share the same pathological basis with a few differences. So let me talk about MSA and the problem with protein folding. Well, these prion diseases occur when proteins misfold and cause a disease state themselves. They can occur spontaneously by sheer absolute chance, or they can be hereditary or infectious. They produce this infectious material that's made up only of proteins, and this material is able to replicate inside the body, giving rise to more infectious material. So let's work through a little bit of a schematic of what this might mean for MSA. The alpha-synuclein is a protein that's expressed normally in our brain all the time, and it's held in these little sacs called vesicles that contain heavy amounts of protein. Alpha-synuclein exists in a normal conformation in which it's tightly coiled up, and every so often it will fold in a different way. And what we believe happens in MSA is that the protein folds in a way in that it has the ability to entice other alpha-synuclein molecules to take on the same shape. And this triggers a chain reaction. And this is called the prion process, which these aggregates sort of clump together and they make more and more infectious material. So it's really sort of a chain, what we think is a chain reaction. And these small clumps of alpha-synuclein, or the alpha-synuclein itself, are taken up by oligodendroglial cells in the brain, and they eventually accumulate to destroy the cell. Now, these oligodendroglial cells are hugely important for the normal function of our central nervous system because they provide support and insulation to the long axons of the nerve. So they're critically important in the health of the nervous system. And what they can do is once these prion-like proteins we believe accumulate in cells, they can be transmitted on a cell-to-cell basis. So other cells may pick up this protein and also suffer from this chain reaction. And in 2003, it was the Nobel Prize winner Stanley Prusinger that came up with a beautiful study in which linked MSA as a potential pathology involving prion proteins. What they did is they took material from a person with MSA, they infected it into an animal model, and they saw that the animal model had a quick decline and developed neurological features that they thought were somewhat similar to MSA. And when they looked at the pathology of these mice that were infected, they saw that the brains show the same pathological changes to MSA. Now, why am I telling you this? Why is any of this important? Well, if we can find the prion proteins and alpha-synuclein are linked with the pathophysiology of MSA, we have a potential culprit that we can chase. See, this now, although this is controversial, there appears to be compelling evidence or increasing evidence that this alpha-synuclein formed in the brains of MSA patients is transmissible from one cell to another and therefore is a prion disease. Now, let's move on. I think the second biggest breakthrough that came in MSA is the ability to diagnose MSA at an earlier stage. I'm going to tell you briefly about a research study, an observational research study that we have that's funded by both the MSA Coalition and the National Institutes of Health to study the natural history of rare autonomic diseases. And this paper that just came out last month brought us closer to being able to find an early marker for being able to diagnose MSA before the motor problems develop. And you may have seen this article that we put out as well, describing the potential implications for early diagnosis of MSA. So let me tell you that around 50% of patients that are eventually diagnosed as MSA report autonomic symptoms as their initial problem. The autonomic nervous system is the part of the nervous system that controls the involuntary actions like breathing, heart rate, control of the blood pressure, control of the gut, control of the bladder. And I no need to tell you that although the presentation of MSA and the types of autonomic symptoms that people with MSA have, they are common. And they can occur early. So what we did is we took 100 patients that have orthostatic hypertension. This is a condition where blood pressure is essentially either normal or slightly elevated when you're lying down and falls to low levels when you're standing up. So we had 70 men and 30 women, and we followed them for 4 years in duration. And one of the things we saw is that a number of these patients went on to develop problems with movement disorder. Those that had a movement disorder, 96% of them that went on to develop problems with movement had something first called REM sleep behavior disorder. Normally, when you sleep and you're dreaming in the REM phase sleep, your body shuts off so you don't move. One of the early signs we think of a neurological problem in the brain is acting out dreams. So patients will often have dream reenactment in which they, instead of being sleep and still and silent when they're sleeping, they will physically act out dreams. And that's very common. We saw that in both patients that went on to develop Parkinson's disease, but we also saw that dream enactment was common in patients that also went on to develop multiple system atrophy. And remember, these are patients that didn't have multiple system atrophy when they came to our clinic. The only thing they had was problems with low blood pressure. But we kept following them, and we saw that there was at least 6 patients that converted or transitioned to developing the full clinical diagnosis of MSA. So we think this group are an important group of patients because they tell us how MSA presents in a prospective format. The patients that went on to develop Parkinson's disease, they typically started with autonomic problems in their mid-60s, whereas those that went on to develop multiple system atrophy started with autonomic problems earlier in their 50s. Those that went on to develop MSA had more severe urinary issues, more problems with the bladder prior to their diagnosis. And they also had something that we found very interesting, which is a normal sense of smell. I know you've been hearing today about sensitivity to smells and smell loss being common in Parkinson's disease, but what we found was that patients that went on to develop MSA, they had a preserved sense of smell. And we also saw that if we look closely, and we asked our neurologists very closely to examine the movement in finite detail, although they weren't diagnosing patients with MSA, they did notice that there was slight impairment in movement disorders that may give us some clues as to which patients might be at risk of developing MSA. So, the way we look at this in the clinic is doing something called odds ratios. And I just want to walk you through, because I think here with the odds ratios, we're getting closer to being able to look at the particular clinical features of a patient that predict the likelihood of them developing MSA before the motor problems or the problems with movement occur. If you have low blood pressure standing, which is common in certain patients with MSA, and you also have REM sleep behavior disorder, you have an increased risk of developing an alpha-synucleinopathy disease, these diseases of the abnormal accumulation of alpha-synuclein. And if we add smell, the ability to smell with a scratch and sniff booklet, and we try and predict further which patients are going to develop MSA versus those that develop Parkinson's disease, we see something very interesting. What we see is that there's a group of patients that if you ask them, they don't necessarily report it, but if you ask them how well they identify smells, they don't identify them particularly well. They get a lot of them wrong. And those patients have an increased likelihood of developing Parkinson's disease or Lewy body dementia. However, if smell is intact and people retain the ability to be able to recognize smells, and they also have this acting out dreams, and they also have this low blood pressure standing, then there's an increased risk that there's a future likelihood of developing MSA. We also looked at something called autonomic biomarkers, and all you need to know about a biomarker is that it's something that represents a disease or the progression of the disease that is something you can measure in either an image, a blood test, or as constellation of clinical symptoms. So we looked at certain autonomic biomarkers, and what we found is there are certain blood tests that you can have to look at, for example, the amount of neurohormone norepinephrine that you're releasing from the nerves that control blood pressure. And if that release of norepinephrine tends to be high, then there's an increased likelihood, about 18 times more, that somebody may be developing or may have a future increased risk of developing MSA. So all this long-winded story of odds ratios and things like that is just to tell you that we are closer to the premotor diagnosis of MSA. We know we can see particular features in a patient with their clinical features and their biomedical profiles that predict that they have a high risk of developing multiple system atrophy in the future. So we have a culprit, and we have a potential window of opportunity to intervene. So why is this important? Well, if we consider that this prion-like process, we now have a target. Whether it is a prion-like process, it's always involving alpha-synuclein. So this is something we can aim at. This is something we can develop strategies, and those strategies may occur in different ways, but we have a target. And what we need to do with this target is stop the spread of alpha-synuclein throughout the brain. Because we know that in multiple system atrophy, the brainstem and the cerebellum are filled with these sort of clumps of this insoluble protein that eventually destroys the cell, and that spreads throughout the nervous system. And what our goal is now is to be able to stop this. You see, what I'm showing you here is just a representation. It's a cartoon to kind of walk you through why I think that these are two really important processes that we have. Here you see age across the bottom with a number of remaining nerve cells in the brain. And when we age normally, we do lose a few nerve cells in the brain. But in MSA, this process is very rapid. So you have a very early onset of quick loss of nerve cells in the central nervous system. And you have quite a lot of reserve in your nerve capacity. So it's not until the nerve cells fall below a particular point that you start to see clinical features of MSA. So what you have is what we call this prodromal, this pre-motor, this pre-movement period, where you don't have problems with movement. And that's why we think that this is a potential window of opportunity to intervene. If we can identify which patients have an increased likelihood of developing MSA, we can potentially target their alpha-synuclein spread before this reaches areas that completely destroy movement. So I think we are closer to being able to define when to intervene, and we just need the tools of how to intervene, but we have a target. So where are we when it comes to developing new compounds for the treatment of MSA? So I'm going to talk now about treatment trials. And let me tell you that clinical trials fall into two broad categories. You can have observational research trials in which you are tracking clinical information without giving an intervention. And these studies, even though they just follow the natural history of the disease, they are critically important because they allow us to plan for clinical trials. And clinical trials cannot happen if we don't first have the benchmarks of what we need to improve, how fast things progress, how best we can measure them. And that information comes from observational clinical trials. Then you have interventional clinical trials in which you give a compound with the aim of improving somebody. These interventional clinical trials can either be a symptomatic treatment, which only affects symptoms and not the cause of the disease, or they can be disease-modifying treatments, like something that slows down the progression or the course of the disease. So when you're entering into clinical trials, you should be aware that there's different expectations. You may be just sharing your clinical information, or you may be trying a new treatment aimed at symptoms or modifying the disease course. So when it comes to developing new drugs, let me give you some background on this. We can either build new compounds or we can use existing compounds. We have to take those compounds and we test them in animals or other models of cells or test tubes to see if they have any potential benefit from a mouse that has MSA or from a cell of a person that has MSA. And if we see good signs of that, we then have to go and perform clinical trials. Now, imagine if we had 100 potential compounds that could be used as treatments for MSA. The first thing we need to do with those compounds is test for toxicity. You want to make sure that the potential benefits of the compound outweigh the side effects. So this is what's called a phase 1 trial, in which an experimental drug is given to healthy people just to see if it's safe. And about a third of all drugs fail at that hurdle. If a drug makes it, it moves on to a phase 2 trial. And phase 2 trials are where the experimental compound is taken to a small sample of people with the disease to see if it makes them better. And again, about a third of drugs fall at that hurdle too. If a drug is able to make it past the phase 2, it will go into a phase 3 trial in which it's tested on a larger population of patients with the disease. And this is to determine which dose makes them feel better. And of course, not all drugs make it through the phase 3 trial. So you should understand the different phases of treatment trials that you're entering may influence the likelihood of a compound making it as a successful treatment for MSA. So what about participating in clinical trials? Well, the first thing you should ask yourself really is, should I expect my symptoms to improve, or am I just sharing my clinical information to help me or others? The next thing you may want to ask yourself is will this treatment change the course of my disease, or is it a symptomatic treatment? And then what's the likelihood that this treatment will really make it as a viable treatment for MSA? Like, what phase is it in? Is it very early? Is it somewhat more established? So then the other thing you need to ask as well is what will happen to me during the clinical trial? How many visits will I have to undergo? What kind of tests will I have to undergo? And this information should be clearly stated for you by the person that's consenting you for the study trial. You can take home a copy of your consent form that you signed, so you can keep you can read over the information again. You can find out when you're expected to come back, what will be expected to happen, and you can have this information. It's called the informed consent form. So when participating in clinical trials, of course, it's a big burden for families, but it's something that is so important to make research in MSA move faster. Without your participation in clinical trials, new treatments just wouldn't make it to the clinic. So where can you get this information? There's a website called clinicaltrials.gov. And all clinical trials are listed on here, and you'll be able to find out participating sites, what's involved in the study, whether it's an interventional study, whether it's a observational study, and that information will be listed there. So yesterday I did a search for multiple system atrophy. And in the world, there are 127 studies for multiple system atrophy. Not all of these are really for MSA. Because when you look at the search terms, what clinicaltrials.gov is doing is pulling multiple and system and atrophy. So you have to read through this to find out which trials are really for patients with MSA. There are 4 studies for patients with MSA in the tri-state area. And I was surprised to see, but they're actually at NYU University, which is our center. So not that I want to publicize my own studies, but I do want to tell you that the information is there. And I want to give you some information now about the kind of trials that you could participate in. So first of all, there are symptomatic treatments for patients that have low blood pressure standing. There's orthostatic hypertension. Not all patients with MSA have orthostatic hypertension, but a good number do. So let me just tell you quickly what is orthostatic hypertension. This is, across the top here, you see this is blood pressure measured in at the arm level, which represents the blood pressure at heart level. And this is flow through one of the arteries in the brain. So you can actually measure in the clinic, in the autonomic clinic, cerebral blood flow. You can see that when the person is lying down, the blood pressure is 120/85, so it's relatively normal, it's okay. But when that person stands up, there's a dramatic fall in blood pressure that's caused by the nerves being unable to respond appropriately, release norepinephrine, and keep the blood pressure up. So you see that when this gentleman is standing up, this is a tracing from a patient, his blood pressure falls to 68/55, and you can see that his cerebral blood flow is low. So that's going to give him symptoms of orthostatic lightheadedness, dizziness, feeling like he might faint. And when he sits down, his blood pressure comes up to 95/62, and you can see that his cerebral blood flow has come back up, almost back to where it was at baseline. I just want to make this point is when you're treating low blood pressure problems in patients with MSA, you don't necessarily need to return the blood pressure back to normal to get rid of the symptoms, because it's about how much blood supply you get back to the head. And there are various different ways in which we can enhance that. We have a clinical study of 2 compounds that are involved in blocking the reuptake of norepinephrine, keeping it high in the circulating blood, and maintaining blood pressure when you're standing. So we have a a trial of a short-acting compound, and we also have a trial of a long-acting compound. So if you do have neurogenic orthostatic hypertension, I would encourage you to visit clinicaltrials.gov and to look into potential treatment trials that you may want to participate in. So let me move on now by telling you about the observational trials we have for patients with MSA. 2 years ago, we were funded by the Michael J. Fox Foundation. Parkinson's disease shares a similar pathophysiology as multiple system atrophy. And as part of this study, we're following patients with MSA to look at their visual problems, to look at their eye, which is something that we've been very interested in. Quite recently, we had a paper that came out looking at the nerve layer in the eye and how this deteriorates over time in patients with MSA. If you are interested in participating in this study, it will involve a scan of the retina. You can see here my two colleagues, Dr. Alberto Palma and Dr. Carlos Mendoza. Dr. Carlos is looking at Dr. Palma's eye. So we've all volunteered for this study, and I know there are people in the audience that have volunteered for this study. So I just want you to know that that's out there, that's available. You know, we are focused on the eye in MSA, and we believe that that's an important area of research. The next thing we have is the observational study that I told you about that enabled us to pick up the early markers of MSA. And we're building an international team, putting people together, and we have various investigators from throughout the world that are contributing to this study. It involves, I'm not going to go through this in detail because time is pressing, but it involves a series of basic clinical tests, and we take your clinical information, we record it in special forms, we store it in a database, and we use that information. It's anonymous, it's confidential, but it provides us with a vast resource to be able to study progression and which treatments improve quality of life for patients with MSA at different stages. So these are our international sites that are all contributing to and sending their data to New York University, which is just down the road from New Jersey. So we're centralizing all of that, and we're taking clinical information. We also have a contact registry that is supported by the MSA Coalition, who have been amazing in making this happen. Here is the link to register for the contact registry. If you haven't received an email telling you about the MSA New Jersey regional meeting, you are not registered in the contact registry, and I will make sure that everybody has access to this. This registry, you can self-register yourself. So you go online, you fill your clinical information. This information gets sent to a data coordinating center with the National Institutes of Health. And we share this only with the investigators in the consortium that we're working with. And we can use this as a way to contact you again to let you know about surveys, about clinical trials that you may want to participate in. So it's a way of staying connected. Now, one of the things that we are doing right now is we're bringing out the MSA electronic survey. We've designed a survey in which we want to ask patients with MSA key questions that will help us answer some of the issues about the disease. We've divided this into sort of these general questions about the general well-being. There's questions about movement, there's questions about sleep, there's questions about autonomic, and there's questions about other features. And I want to encourage you all, if you can, when the registry, join the registry and help us with the questionnaire, because this is going to give, it's been designed by MSA experts from Innsbruck, from New York University, with the input of people from the Autonomic Disorders Consortium. So it does have key clinical questions that will be very useful for us in the future. So I'm going to leave you with this. This is an image of an oligodendroglial cell stained. These are the type of cells that are affected in MSA. These are the cells that are important for the health of the nervous system. And these are the cells that we are targeting to see if we can keep these cells alive and we can stop the progression of MSA. We still need better treatments, and we need your involvement in research, whether it's treatment trials, observational studies, or surveys, because together we can work together in making progress. And we need the brightest minds working on MSA. I'm going to leave you now with a picture of, this is the faculty at the International MSA meeting in Salerno in Italy, where we all came together. There was a fantastic attendance at the meeting, over 100 people dedicated for 2 days thinking about MSA. So these are the minds out there that are working on your disease. These are the people that are thinking about this problem, how to solve it, how to preserve movement, and you have a great international team of super smart people working on this. I'm excited to share with you that the sixth International Multiple System Atrophy scientific meeting to bring scientists to the field to discuss MSA in a 2-day intensive meeting will be held at New York University. So we're bringing them here. Thank you very much.
Are there medicines available in Europe that are not available here?
There are medicines being developed in Europe because MSA is a very sporadic disease. The challenge of running clinical trials means that no single center has enough patients to independently do trials. So there is a big movement now in the international communities that trials should be multi-center and should involve different regions. Yeah.
Is the public invited to this conference at NYU?
Not this one. These are international scientific meetings, so it's just for clinical investigators, basic scientists to come together. All these research groups that are working on MSA, clinicians, with an idea that this is sort of a big, think tank to move forward things like diagnostic criteria, treatment trials, best way to measure changes in a clinical trial. But this is not, just to clarify, it's not a meeting open to patients, this one.
Katie and I are already in the retinal trial at your office. You mentioned there are 4. What are the other ones at NYU that we can?
There are 2 on compounds for low blood pressure standing. One that's a short-acting compound that you may take once a day if it's effective, or one that is may take a few times a day, and one that is a longer-acting compound. So those are the 2 treatment trials. We have the Michael J. Fox retinal biomarker study, which is an observational study, and then we also have the natural history study of MSA that's collecting clinical information.
So I just want to make a point here, which I do every year. We've participated in about 12 trials, and I just want to say that it's very important that as many of you as possible volunteer for these trials. Without it, nothing happens.
I couldn't have said it better. Thank you.